The first sign that something was wrong wasn't her voice. It was the way she didn't look up from her phone. Normally, she'd at least glance at me across the marble breakfast island, even if it was just to give a pointed remark about my hair or shirt. But that morning, her eyes stayed locked on her screen, thumb moving in deliberate swipes. When she finally spoke, her tone was as flat as the porcelain plate between us. "I've decided I want a divorce." No build-up. No hesitation. Just, announced like a quarterly report. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so in character for her. I knew Ava could fire a man, bankrupt his business, and be at Pilates within the hour, all without her pulse breaking a sweat. But hearing those words aimed at me was still a different kind of gut punch. She set her phone down, folding her perfectly manicured hands as if she were the benevolent one in this exchange. "We can make this easy. You'll get a settlement, generous enough for you to live comfortably, so long as you keep your mouth shut about certain matters." Certain matters. That was her polite way of saying she didn't want her board, her clients, or the media knowing that our marriage was an iceberg of mutual convenience, with no love in sight for years. That, and the possibility she'd been screwing a younger executive from her mergers department. I picked up my coffee, letting the bitterness roll over my tongue while my heartbeat tried to punch its way out of my ribcage. I didn't trust myself to speak right away, not with the first wave of humiliation still burning in my throat. Her expression didn't waver. "You'll be free to do whatever you want. And I'll have room to pursue what I need." Room. Like I was a piece of antique furniture she'd decided no longer matched the decor. I set my cup down carefully, making sure my hand didn't shake. "All right." That single word seemed to surprise her. As if she'd expected a scene, tears, maybe even begging. But if there's one thing I've learned from living in Ava's world, it's that power shifts fastest when you don't give the other person the reaction they're expecting. I didn't tell her that I'd already been thinking about leaving. That the only thing keeping me tethered was the fact that she controlled the keys to everything, the apartment, the accounts, the carefully crafted image we wore like expensive armor. I certainly didn't tell her that I had no intention of walking away empty-handed. So I smiled, just enough to be polite, just enough to make her question if she'd miscalculated. And in that moment, while she thought she was closing a deal, I was opening a new one in my head. She thought this was the end. But to me, it felt like the start of something dangerous, and possibly, delicious. When I first met Ava, she wasn't Ava Sinclair, CEO of Sinclair Global Holdings. She was just Ava, a sharp-eyed woman in a black cocktail dress at a charity auction, laughing at something I said about overpriced champagne. I didn't know then that she was already testing me. Ava didn't date. She evaluated candidates. I must have passed the interview, because within weeks I'd traded my tiny apartment for her penthouse view of the city. At first, it was intoxicating. Not just her, the life. The private cars, the black tie galas, the dinners where the wine menu didn't have prices because if you needed to ask, you didn't belong. I thought I'd stumbled into a fairy tale, except the castle was glass and the queen had a quarterly profit target. The contract of our marriage wasn't written down, but it was understood. She would take care of the money, the empire, and the reputation. I would be the charming, well-dressed spouse, the one who made her look approachable, relatable, human. In return, she promised security, stability, a place at her table. What I didn't realize was that security could be revoked the moment it stopped serving her. Over the years, my own ambitions started to shrink to fit her shadow. I had ideas once, my own career plans. But when you're married to someone like Ava, the gravitational pull of her world bends everything toward her orbit. At first, I convinced myself it was temporary. That one day she'd help me launch my own projects, the way she helped her executives climb the ladder. But every time I brought it up, she'd smile the way you do at a child insisting they can drive the car, and say, "You don't need that. You have me." That was the moment, I think, when the first cracks in the glass castle began to show. It wasn't about love, not anymore, maybe not ever. It was about position, optics, and usefulness. And once she'd decided I was no longer useful, she'd moved to cut her losses. Only she underestimated me. Ava believed she was the only one who could play the game. What she didn't know was that I'd been studying her playbook for years, quietly collecting my own pieces on the board. Her settlement offer wasn't a gift. It was hush money. And hush money meant she had something to hide, something I could use. If our marriage had been a contract, then this divorce was just a breach of terms. And I was ready to collect every cent of the penalty. Ava never kept cash. She considered it a poor man's habit, an ironic statement coming from a woman whose personal spending could match a small country's GDP. But she did keep something else, information. The safe in her private study wasn't flashy. No gold trim, no ridiculous biometric scanner, just a matte black box bolted inside a custom-built cabinet. I'd seen her open it only twice in all the years we'd been married. The first time was to lock away an engagement ring she'd been given before me, a diamond the size of a thumbnail. The second time was the night before her first hostile takeover. She'd pulled out a plain leather folder, glanced through the papers inside, and smiled in that way that meant someone, somewhere, was about to lose everything. I told myself I wasn't going to go near it. That would have been a line I couldn't cross. But then came the divorce announcement, the generous settlement, the smug assumption I'd fade quietly into obscurity. Lines, I decided, were for people without motive. Ava's study was easy enough to access. She'd been careless lately, leaving her schedule sprawled across the digital calendar we still shared. She'd be at a lunch meeting for at least 2 hours. I wore gloves. Not because I was afraid of fingerprints, she'd never think to dust them, but because it made me feel like the kind of person who knew exactly what they were doing. The safe's keypad gleamed under the recessed lighting. My first 2 guesses were wrong. The third, her mother's birthday, rewarded me with the quietest of clicks. Inside, it wasn't stacks of bonds or gold bars. It was better. Folders, USB drives, and an embossed envelope with the Sinclair Holdings crest. Inside the envelope were documents, merger contracts, preliminary deals, wire transfer confirmations. One of them stood out, a pending international acquisition worth more than either of us had ever publicly admitted she could pull off. The dates told me it hadn't been finalized yet. The names on the wiring instructions told me where her personal funds would go once it did. An offshore account, private, untouchable, unless you already had the routing codes. And now I did. I slipped the folder back exactly as I found it, memorizing the string of numbers like they were a prayer. As I closed the safe and spun the dial, a strange calm settled over me. This wasn't theft. This was severance pay. And unlike Ava's offer, mine was non-negotiable. The invitation had arrived weeks ago. Engraved lettering, black satin envelope, the kind of stationery that told you the champagne would cost more than your car. Ava insisted we attend together. Of course she did. A final show for the shareholders before she dismantled me from her narrative. The gala was at the Eddington Hotel, 30 stories of polished marble and understated wealth. We stepped out of the car into a barrage of camera flashes, her hand looped loosely through my arm. To the outside world, we looked exactly as we always had, poised, enviable, untouchable. Inside, the air was thick with expensive perfume and quiet competition. The city's power players mingled in designer tuxedos and gowns that whispered with every step. Ava floated from conversation to conversation, dispensing smiles like currency. I stayed close enough to play the role but far enough to keep her guessing where my mind was. I knew where it was. On a string of numbers tucked in my memory, and on the ticket I'd booked that afternoon under a name she didn't know. "Darling," Ava said suddenly, turning to me with that camera-ready tilt of her chin, "this is Vincent Hale. He's been making waves in our mergers division." Vincent was younger than me by at least a decade, with the kind of jawline you saw in cologne ads. His handshake was warm, but his eyes lingered on Ava just a shade too long. I wondered if she realized how transparent it was. I wondered if she cared. "Pleasure," I said, smiling like I didn't already know his name had been murmured in certain private whispers about her. For the next hour, I played my part, laughing when I was supposed to, leaning in at the right moments, keeping my hand on the small of her back just enough for the photographers to capture. If this was our final act as a couple, I was determined to make it Oscar-worthy. But every time I caught her watching Vincent across the room, my resolve sharpened. She thought she'd already won, that she'd discarded me without cost. She had no idea I'd already taken something she valued more than any man, control. When the night wound down, Ava offered her arm again for the cameras outside. I took it, smiling, thinking about how in 48 hours, I'd be halfway across the world, and she'd be standing in this city wondering how the hell she'd lost me, and a fortune, without ever seeing the knife go in. The transfer window was small. 36 hours before Ava's deal closed and her offshore account froze into an untouchable fortress of encrypted numbers. If I was going to move, it had to be now. I chose 2:17 a.m., the city asleep, Ava deep in one of her ambient-induced comas upstairs. The glow from my laptop painted the study in cold blue light. My hands hovered over the keyboard, steady but wired with adrenaline. First step, connect to the VPN routed through 3 countries. Second, access the shell account I'd set up months ago under a corporate entity that didn't technically exist. Third, type in those memorized routing numbers, every digit burning into the screen like a confession. The numbers on her account balance were obscene. Not the kind of money you earn, the kind you collect, scraps from broken companies, bonuses for deals that leave hundreds jobless, interest compounding on other people's misery. It took 6 keystrokes to set the transfer in motion. 6 taps, and millions began sliding through digital pipelines to a bank in Zurich that had never heard of Ava Sinclair. I watched the progress bar crawl forward, my breath shallow. At 42%, a thought hit me: if she woke up now, if she walked in wearing one of her silk robes and asked why I was in her study, it would all be over. But the house stayed silent. At 100%, a confirmation screen popped up, funds successfully transferred. No fireworks. No triumphant music. Just a flat line of text that meant my life had just split clean in 2, before and after. I wiped every trace from the laptop, logged out, and shut it down. My pulse was still hammering, but a strange lightness had settled in my chest. This wasn't just about the money. This was about leverage. About walking away not as the discarded spouse she expected, but as someone who could afford to never look back. By the time I slipped into bed beside her, she was still breathing evenly, oblivious. I stared at the ceiling, already mapping my next move. The money was gone. Soon, I would be too. The call came at 9:03 a.m. I was in a cafe 3 blocks from the penthouse, sipping burnt coffee and pretending to read the business section when her name lit up my phone. I let it ring twice before answering, just long enough for her to know I wasn't scrambling to please her anymore. "Where is it?" No greeting, no preamble. Her voice was sharp, brittle, like a crystal about to shatter. "Where's what?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "Don't play with me," she hissed. "The account is empty. You think I wouldn't notice millions vanishing overnight? Do you have any idea what you've done?" I almost smiled. Yes, I thought. I knew exactly what I'd done. Out loud, I said, "Relax, Ava. We've both made investments in this marriage. I'm just collecting my share. You stole from me." "No," I said, keeping my voice low and measured, "I took what was mine. The difference is more than semantics." Her breathing hitched, the sound of someone losing the battle to stay calm. "If you think you can get away with this, you're out of your mind. I can have you in handcuffs by lunch." "You could," I said. "But then you'd have to explain where the money came from in the first place. Offshore accounts. Pending deals. Wire transfers that would look questionable in the wrong light." There was a pause, 2 seconds of silence heavy enough to confirm I'd landed the blow. "You ungrateful little," she cut herself off, her tone snapping back to something cooler, more calculated. "This isn't over." "It's already over," I said, and hung up before she could finish whatever threat she'd been preparing. I set the phone face down on the table, my hand steady. I'd picked it at random from an old conference attendee list I'd found in one of Ava's desk drawers. No ID required, just a $50 bill slid across the counter to a man who didn't care who I was as long as it wasn't his problem. The bed was lumpy, the TV barely worked, and the single light bulb flickered in protest, but for the first time in years, I could breathe without calculating my every word and move. On my burner phone, I saw the first ripple of Ava's hunt, a news alert about minor irregularities in Sinclair Global's financial reports, buried deep in the business pages. I knew her PR team would bury the story by morning, but it told me one thing: she'd already realized this wasn't going to be handled quietly. I made myself move again before midnight. Never 2 nights in the same place, a rule I'd decided on before I even touched her safely. The next stop was a roadside inn in a town so small it didn't have a Starbucks, just a single diner with plastic booths and bottomless coffee. I sat in the corner, watching the locals trickle in, and for the first time in years, I was just nobody. No cameras. No boardroom gossip. No calculated smiles. But being nobody didn't mean I was safe. Ava had the money, resources, and spite to burn a path straight to me if I wasn't careful. And I wasn't just running from her, I was running toward something. I didn't know exactly where yet. But I had enough to buy time. And time, in Ava's world, was worth more than gold. It was in Marseille, of all places, that I met her. The city was a blur of salt air, cobblestone streets, and markets that smelled of saffron and roasting meat. I'd been living like a ghost, cash transactions, no fixed address, and a habit of checking over my shoulder every other block. Marseille was supposed to be just another stop on my moving map, a place to disappear for a week before crossing into Spain. I ducked into a narrow café near the port, the kind of place with 2 tables crammed against the wall and a chalkboard menu in slanted handwriting. She was already there, tucked into the corner, laptop open, a cup of black coffee cooling beside her. "Mind if I sit?" I asked, gesturing at the empty chair. The place was full, and she barely looked up before nodding. Her name was Elara. No last name offered, which I respected. She was an entrepreneur in the truest sense, the kind who didn't wait for a board's approval, who built something out of nothing because she was too stubborn to accept failure. She was working on a logistics startup that specialized in discreet international shipping. It was the way she asked questions that caught me off guard. Not like Ava, who used curiosity as a scalpel to dissect weaknesses. Elara listened. She let silence hang without filling it, and when she spoke, it was to offer something in return, not to take. "You've got the look of someone who's planning their next move," she said after a while, eyes sharp but not unkind. "Maybe I am." She smiled. "You should plan it with someone who knows the terrain." We talked until the cafe closed, and I learned more about trust in that one evening than I had in the last 5 years of marriage. She didn't need me to prove my worth with grand gestures or calculated charm. She only asked that I be useful, and honest. I left with her number scrawled on the back of a receipt, and a strange feeling I hadn't expected to carry, the sense that my escape might be more than just survival. It might be the start of something I could actually build. It started with a headline. I was sitting at a sun-bleached table outside a cafe in Nice, sipping espresso and watching tourists argue with street vendors, when the notification buzzed on my burner phone. Sinclair Global merger in jeopardy after leaked documents surface. I tapped the link. The article was vague, as these things always were at first, but the subtext was clear. Confidential details of Ava's biggest acquisition had somehow made their way into a competitor's hands. The deal was under review. Stockholders were concerned. Anonymous sources inside the company were losing faith in leadership. I read it twice, then again, just to savor the words. Ava hated 2 things more than failure: public embarrassment and loss of control. This was both. I didn't have to guess where the leak had come from. I'd been careful, indirect, making sure the trail would lead through enough false hands that even Ava's best investigators couldn't point directly to me. But I knew she'd suspect. Of course she would. By the end of the day, 3 more outlets had picked up the story. Analysts were speculating on the collapse of the deal. The board had called an emergency meeting. I imagined Ava in her glass-walled office, jaw tight, nails tapping the desk, scanning the room for weakness. She'd try to patch the wound, but the blood was already in the water. Elara slid into the chair across from me, glancing at my screen. "You're doing?" I didn't answer, but she smiled like she already knew. "You're playing a dangerous game," she said, stirring her coffee. "I'm not playing," I replied. "I'm ending one." But even as I said it, I knew Ava wouldn't go down quietly. She wasn't just going to lick her wounds and disappear. She was going to come for me. And I was starting to think I wanted her to. I should have known the quiet wouldn't last. It was a warm afternoon in Marseille, the kind where the port smells of salt and frying fish, and I'd almost convinced myself that Ava had retreated to repair her empire. Elara and I were at the small cafe where we'd first met, discussing a shipping route over maps spread across the table, when the shadow fell over us. Her shadow. I looked up, and there she was, Ava Sinclair, in a white linen suit tailored like a blade, sunglasses hiding eyes I knew were burning. She looked wrong here, like she'd been carved out of a skyscraper and dropped into the wrong skyline. "Elara," I said slowly, "would you excuse us for a moment?" Elara's gaze flicked between us, reading the temperature of the air, then she stood and slipped inside without a word. Ava took her seat, crossing her legs with surgical precision. "You're hard to find," she said. Her voice was cool, but the faint tremor in her hand as she set down her clutch betrayed the strain. "I wasn't hiding," I replied. "You took my money." "Our money," I corrected. Her lips thinned. "Don't play semantics with me. Do you have any idea what your little stunt has cost me? Deals unraveling, investors pulling out, my board." She stopped, as if realizing she was giving me too much. I leaned back, letting her fill the silence. Finally, she leaned forward, lowering her voice. "We can fix this. You come back, return what you took, and I can make all of this disappear. I almost laughed. You don't want me back. You want control back. Her jaw tightened. Control is the only thing that keeps people like us alive. That's where you're wrong, I said. Control kept me caged. Now I'm alive. For a moment, the mask slipped, just a flicker, and I saw the real Ava underneath, not the untouchable CEO, but the woman who hated losing, who feared irrelevance more than death. You'll regret this, she said finally, standing. Maybe, I said. But not today. She walked away without looking back, the click of her heels swallowed by the sounds of the port. I knew she wasn't done. Ava never left the table without a counterplay. And that meant the next move would be mine. The call came just after midnight. I almost didn't answer. Ava's number flashing on the burner felt like a trap, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to hear the tone she'd use now that the merger was dead and her spotless image had taken a public beating. Her voice was softer this time, almost hesitant. We need to talk. I let a beat pass. About what? About us. I almost laughed. Ava didn't talk about us. She talked about deals, appearances, and strategic benefits. But the word, us, came out of her mouth like it was foreign, like she'd had to taste it before committing. I've been thinking, she went on, her voice low, stripped of the cold precision she wore like armor. I miss what we had. I miss you. It would have sounded sincere if I hadn't spent years studying her timing. She didn't miss me, she missed the stability, the control, the guarantee that I'd always be in my assigned place beside her. I've moved on, Ava. You don't have to, she said quickly. We can start over. I'll make room for what you want this time. You'll have the freedom you always asked for, but we'll do it together. Her pitch was perfect, the promise of freedom wrapped in the safety net of her power. I imagined someone else, years ago, maybe even me back then, saying yes to that offer. But I wasn't that person anymore. I have my own life now, I said. And it's mine in a way it never was with you. There was a sharp exhale, like she'd been holding her breath for the yes she thought she'd earn. When it didn't come, the steel slid back into her tone. You'll regret this. Maybe, I said, echoing my words at the port. But not today. I ended the call before she could speak again, staring at the dark screen in my hand. For the first time, there was no lingering sting, no aftertaste of doubt. Ava's world was no longer mine to orbit. The warehouse was nothing special at first glance, weathered brick, peeling paint, the faint scent of old oil in the air. But to me, it was a blank canvas. Elara and I had spent weeks hunting for the right location. We needed space for the shipping side of her business and the small consulting operation I'd been quietly building. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. No shareholders, no boardroom politics, no one holding the keys but us. The first day we opened the doors, the morning sun poured in through cracked windows and painted the floor in gold. I stood there, coffee in hand, breathing in the quiet hum of possibility. We hired locals, people who didn't care about last names or scandals on the business pages. They cared about paychecks, steady work, and the fact that we didn't talk down to them. I liked that. It felt clean in a way my old life never did. Ava still lingered at the edges. A name in headlines I didn't click, a number I didn't answer. Once, I caught a glimpse of her on a muted television above the bar, a press conference, her hair sharper than her smile, talking about resilience and strategic recovery. She looked unshaken, but I could see the strain in the set of her jaw. I didn't feel triumph, not anymore. Just distance. Like she belonged to another version of me, one I'd finally stopped dragging around. By the end of the month, the warehouse was humming. Containers came and went, invoices rolled in, and the numbers on my account climbed in quiet, satisfying increments. It wasn't millions overnight, but it was mine. Every cent was mine. And for the first time since I'd walked out of that penthouse, I realized Ava wasn't my story anymore. She was just a chapter I'd closed. It was late, the kind of night when the city outside the warehouse was quiet except for the occasional hum of a passing car. Elara and I were sitting on the floor, surrounded by open shipping crates, eating takeout straight from the cartons. The burner phone buzzed. The number wasn't saved, but I knew. I almost let it ring out, but Elara glanced at me and said, "Might as well hear it. Then delete it." I answered, "Please." The word was the first thing out of Ava's mouth, and it didn't sound like her at all. It was frayed, breathless, as if she'd been holding it back for weeks and now it had torn free. "Ava. I can't," she broke off, inhaling sharply. Everything's falling apart. The board's replacing me. Vincent's gone. I can't fix it alone. There it was, not love, not longing. Need. The same survival instinct that had driven every one of her decisions, now stripped of its gloss. You're not alone, I said, glancing at Alara beside me. You just don't have me. Her voice cracked. I was wrong. About you. About us. We could still be. No, I said, softly but without hesitation. We were never, Ava. We were an arrangement. And the terms expired. Silence. I could almost hear her swallowing back whatever pride she had left. Then, is she worth it? I didn't look away from Alara when I answered. Every second. The line went dead. No goodbye, no threat. Just absence, as clean as a door shutting for the last time. I set the phone down, the weight of it gone from my hand, and Alara passed me a fork. The noodles were still warm. The night felt lighter. Ava's voice, once sharp enough to cut, was now just an echo. The sea was calm that morning, the kind of stillness that makes the horizon feel infinite. I stood at the end of the dock, a mug of strong coffee in my hands, watching the first light spill over the water. When I'd left Ava's penthouse months ago, I thought freedom would feel like running, like the pounding rush of escape. But standing here now, I understood it was quieter than that. Freedom wasn't the absence of chains, it was waking up without anyone else's script to follow. The warehouse was running smoothly, the shipping contracts stacking up. Alara had just closed her first deal entirely on her own, and I was planning a short trip inland to visit my mother, something I hadn't done in years. The life I'd built wasn't flashy, but it was mine in every detail. Ava still tried sometimes, a stray email through a dummy address, a mutual contact dropping her name in conversation. But she was more memory than presence now, a distant figure pacing in a glass tower that no longer held me. I thought about the first time she'd laid out her terms over that cold breakfast table, the way my pulse had spiked with humiliation and rage. Back then, I'd vowed not to leave empty-handed. I hadn't. I'd taken more than money, I'd taken back myself. A gull cried overhead, and Alara's voice carried down the dock, calling me in for breakfast. I took one last look at the open water before turning back. The horizon would always be there. And now, so would I.